Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote as we welcome two New Hampshire authors to Gibson's Bookstore virtually. We have tonight Sam Kench, who has written The Fall of Polite, and Anthony Caplan, who has written Yet Today. These are two books about different groups of people who are struggling to find their way within society. One is Anthony's is about a man who is struggling as he has an internal struggle against society, and Sam's has an external struggle of society against the characters. So I'm very pleased to welcome these two authors tonight. As I have mentioned before, Gibson's Bookstore Events program is sustained by book sales. So I'm going to put the bookstore links to purchase these two novels into our chat. And as we are starting this chat with these authors, feel free to throw questions into the chat box and I will be answering them as we go. But as we start here, let's start with you, Anthony. Tell us a bit about Yet Today.
Okay, well, just first of all, I'm happy to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with Gibson's and Sam Kench, fabulous young author. Yet Today is it's a contemporary novel. It takes place in New Hampshire. It's about a man who's a high school teacher, and he's been working as a high school teacher for a while, and his kids have grown, and one's off to college, the two girls are in high school. And he finds himself suddenly feeling like social change is hitting him in the face, and he's trying to make sense of his life and make sense of the changing roles that he finds himself in as a father, as a husband, even as a teacher. And so he takes a job one summer working for the Drug Enforcement Agency as a linguist, and the job entails wiretapping these people who are smuggling drugs into New Hampshire, fentanyl and heroin, and so it sort of opens a window to a different world for him, and he realizes that all these social forces it's not just him, it's like the entire country that's going through these things, and so it kind of spurs him to figure out what he can do to make his life better, and sort of break out of the shell that he's in, break out of the box that he finds himself in. Oh, I can't hear you.
And Sam, why don't you tell us a little bit about The Fall of Polite?
Sure. Yeah. So The Fall of Polite is a post-apocalyptic novel. It is set in New Hampshire and New England. There's a little bit of Vermont in there too. You'll recognize some places from around New Hampshire. There's Bristol's in it, Concord, Plymouth. So anyone who's local in the audience will recognize some places as they're described. It's a realistic apocalypse. There's no like zombies. There's no sci-fi or fantasy elements. But I would also say that there's no contagion. There's no viral elements. So it's not too close to our current reality. So if you read for escapism, you can still get that in the book. But you might find it interesting to see the parallels between our currently altered society in real life and the parallels in the altered society in the book. The Fall of Polite is a term that means the end of the world. That's sort of the term I made up for this particular book, and it follows a bunch of different characters. Three main characters, and they each have their own storylines that interweave as they try to adapt and survive in this changing new landscape.
So let me ask you our first question here. Can you clarify if The Fall of Polite refers to a season or an action?
So it's basically polite would be like politeness, the fact that people act politely toward each other. So the fact that people ever act in a civil, polite way, that is what is falling. It's now a kill or be killed kind of, the very sight of another person means danger first and everything else second.
So it's more that politeness has fallen and not it's getting cold and there is no politeness.
Right, yeah, politeness has fallen.
So can you guys tell me a little bit about, these are both set in New Hampshire, as you mentioned. So they're from the same world, but they're very different visions of New Hampshire. Do you guys want to take us through a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, my book is I mean, it's not futuristic or post-apocalyptic, but it's sort of pre-pandemic or where we are now. It's almost a look back in time as where we are now. But it's about the world that we were in before this pandemic, and it wasn't a great situation that we were in. Rising inequality, changing demographics, sort of the opioid crisis, depression, suicide rates, economic situations tough for a lot of people. So that's the kind of world that the New Hampshire that yet today is about. But there's different there's all kinds of different New Hampshires, right? I mean, the New Hampshire of yet today is really sort of a world where there's a lot of families with young children, a lot of people who are not native to New Hampshire who've moved here from different states. And so it's about people who are struggling or kind of on the edge, and trying to make the best that they can, like most people are today.
I feel like arguably New Hampshire is a different place to live in depending on your economic status as well. The experience that one has in different economic tax brackets is going to be very different depending on where you land.
Right. I mean, that's exactly right. And so this character, he seems to be, somewhat comfortable. He's a teacher. He's working. He's got a steady job. He's got an income. But his neighbors, are people who were laid off after the 2008 downturn in the economy, and so the people that he lives around are people who are struggling, and he's like a lot of people, he's somebody, and his family is somebody who's kind of struggling to make ends meet. And the reason he takes the summer job is because his kids are going off to college and he has to earn some extra income. So it's about people who are sort of on the edge, and like one disaster away from the fall of polite, and here we are. We've hit that disaster, so it's kind of interesting. So that's why I call it a pre-pandemic look at New Hampshire.
It's interesting that you mentioned that I've heard that said by several authors, that it feels strange to be writing novels not knowing which way society is going to end up. How do you write a novel that takes place with different fears and different societal norms?
Right. I wrote this obviously before this pandemic, but what I'm trying to do now is go back and look at that book and say, well, here are the threads that are pointing us towards, the world that we're living in now, and what's going to come afterwards. And that's why I'm sort of highlighting the sort of fragile nature of the people that are the characters in the book.
Absolutely. It's fascinating though that there is pre and post apocalyptic fiction already happening. So your book takes place just before the fall of polite, so to speak, but not Sam's fall of polite. But Sam, tell us a little bit about the New Hampshire of your fall of polite.
Yeah, so my book it's very setting based, and like Anthony's book, there's a lot of social commentary and a lot of themes that relate directly to New Hampshire in my book as well. There's a lot of, so even though it is apocalyptic, I'm using that sort of alternate setting as a way to comment on our current political system. And there's a lot of, subtext and exploration on things like racism and sexism and all that, as explored through a post-apocalyptic lens, but as they relate to our, well, again, pre-COVID stuff. It is interesting how now anyone who was in the middle of writing something set in a contemporary, 2020 now has this new angle that is kind of impossible to ignore, I think, moving forward. It would change any kind of modern day set story, I think.
Do you guys want to take us through some of your characters? Who are some of your favorite characters that you were writing about in your stories?
Well, I mean, the main character I've already mentioned is this middle-aged guy who's going through I guess you could call it a midlife crisis, but it's, I think that it's a crisis that we're going through all the time, no matter what age. We're just trying to figure out a way to survive and trying to figure out how we relate to the people around us, and in the midst of change, and so he finds that his role as a father is very different now because his children are grown, and so they don't need him as much, and so he feels like he's really not as useful as a father. He feels like his job is not as fulfilling as it once was. His relationship with his wife is changing, and so but the thing that's most important to him are these different roles: his role as a father, his role as a husband, his role as a teacher. And so he doesn't want to give up on that. So he's struggling. So I mean, it's him. It's the kids and his family are important characters in it too, especially his son. The relationship with his son is very important. His son is off to college, and is somebody who gets kind of radicalized in college and gets into trouble. He is hacking the Department of Defense in a computer hack and gets thrown in jail. So he has to. He's trying to rescue his son. Find out where he is, because he didn't know where he was for a long time. So the relationships he has with his kids, are the most important thing in the book, really.
Yeah, I can take you through my characters. I have 3 protagonists who each have their own goals and their own storyline. One of the main characters is a girl who was still in high school at the time that things fell apart, and still figuring out who she was in the world when the world has changed so dramatically around her. Now she's on a journey to try to find her only living family member, who is the next state over in Vermont. That's where the Vermont stuff comes. So she's heading out on foot through a blizzard in this freshly lawless land. Another character is a former lumberjack who's just had his family ripped away from him, and he's consumed with this undying fury. And the third protagonist is a 2-time college dropout who's never done anything worthwhile, and they're trying to use this new apocalyptic setting all around them as a chance to change that and finally do some good in the world. And I love writing villains too, so there's a kind of a rogues gallery of antagonists throughout the book that I think will be that readers might love to hate, I would hope.
Well, that's an interesting question then to ask both of you. Without spoilers, can any of you guys identify villains in your book? Are villains ourselves? Are villains the people that we didn't expect to be? Are villains faceless people? Are villains society?
Well, in my book, there's very clearly villains. The people he's wiretapping this family of Dominicans who live in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and they're basically a drug smuggling gang, and their family, and their family business is to smuggle fentanyl and heroin into New Hampshire. But what the main character finds, is that these people are as American as his neighbors and as human as the people that that he knows. That they're not really villains. They're just trying to get by like everybody else, and that they happen to be illegal and doing an illegal business. But he starts to become very relativistic about who are villains and who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. And that's one of the things he tries to break out. One of the ways he tries to break out of his box is to try to make contact with these people and find out, not just through this virtual world, through this wiretapping, but to find out more about them, face to face. So that's one of the threads in the story. But I don't want to give away the story, obviously. But I mean, yeah, the whole thing about good guys and bad guys is sort of one of the themes today.
Well, Sam, that brings us to you in that I suspect your villains might be a little bit easier to spot, perhaps, but tell us a little bit about what makes villainy in your world.
Yeah, so I like what Anthony said about the villainy being relative, because no good bad guy thinks they're the bad guy, and I think that's important. But yeah, there are a lot of antagonists in my book, and they probably are a little more clear cut just because it's a world fraught with everyday violence. And I think that villains come in all shapes and sizes and all forms. So I'll give you the kind of broad strokes of two different ones. One is a meth addict who abandons her child in a dumpster to go, score more drugs. And then another is someone who was a cop before the fall of polite and is now using this lawlessness as a chance to grab for more power and try to take control over the area that he used to police with the connections that he still has.
All right, so I will remind everybody that Gibson's Bookstore does sustain our events program through book sales. So the purchase links for these books are in our chat box. If you guys have any questions that you want to throw towards our authors, we'd be happy to read those. So can you guys tell us a little bit about your writing process here? How long did it take you to write these books?
It took me, I'd say 18 months to 2 years to write, to finish from start to end. But probably about a year to get the first draft out. And my writing process is I write at night when I get home, after the kids are in bed and what have you. I try to get an hour or two at night. And then in summer times, I go full bore and just try to get as much writing as I can in my summers. Of course, that's different now because we're working from home, so there's more free time. But that's my process. I worked as a journalist for many years before I became a teacher, and so I found that was very helpful in terms of the discipline of just sitting down and just writing whatever your story is. Just getting the story out, and then the editing is a completely different kettle of fish, as you know, Sam. I mean, as a screenwriter and as a writer, the editing is everything. So it took me about a year to get the first draft done, and then another year to really polish it and get into finished shape.
Yeah, the editing process usually takes me longer than the actual initial writing process for me.
Right.
Yeah, this book took me. It's my first novel, so I don't have much to compare it to. But it took me about 3 years, I think, all in all, from first starting it to completion. I worked on other projects in between, so I wasn't like straight out all the time. But my general writing process is, I'm actually the opposite of Anthony. I always write in the morning, right when I wake up rather. I find I'm most productive before I've had breakfast or lunch or whatever. So I don't usually have breakfast, and I try to write for as long without eating as possible, because I find that as soon as I have a meal or whatever, then my productivity just drops off immediately afterwards. So so on a good day of writing, I end up fasting, and I'll write for 16 hours, and then I'll just catch up on whatever the next day. So yeah, a good day of writing for me is 16 hours. I try to get at least 3 hours of writing every morning, if not more. And I'd say I probably do write every day except for days that I'm on set, if I happen to be working on a short film or something like that.
So I'm curious if there's anything in your lives that helped feed these novels. Anthony, Sam, I'm a little afraid to ask you this question, what might have fed into the fall of polite. But Anthony, is there anything that particularly that this inspired you for this story?
Well, before I wrote Yet Today, I was probably best known for a trilogy of science fiction books. So I decided to focus on contemporary, everyday, small story, sort of the details of everyday life instead of the broad strokes of creating a world and trying to figure out, what kind of society. I knew the society that I wanted to write about, a society that I was living in. So, the things that kind of inspired me were the ingredients of my own life. I'm a father. I have a family myself. I'm also a high school teacher. So the elements that, in my experience, are basically the inspiration for this book, as opposed to pure imagination and pure speculation, which is fun too. I really liked writing the science fiction books, but I just wanted to do something slightly different in this book. So yeah, it's just, it's not autobiographical, but it's like the world that I knew, basically the world of a high school teacher. and a family man and someone who's living in central New Hampshire.
Yeah, so for me, in terms of personal life stuff, a lot of it is actually location driven for me. Um, Around central New Hampshire, if you look hard enough, there's a lot of places you can find that look a little apocalyptic already, and they did years ago. There's like abandoned buildings out in the woods and, crumbling structures, old bridges that have collapsed and stuff, and the pieces are just there. And seeing all that kind of stuff really, gets my mind going, I guess, in terms of apocalyptic stuff. And post-apocalyptic movies and books and TV shows and whatnot, it's always been my favorite setting, the apocalypse. So I knew I wanted to tell a story in that. And this particular story, The Fall of Polite, which wasn't always called that, but it also wasn't always a book. It was a short film at first, and then it was a different short film, and then it was a TV show, then it was a feature film, and then it was a different TV show, and then I finally realized, oh wait, it's a novel. This is what it's supposed to be. Just took a little experimenting to get there.
Well, that would tie in neatly to my next question, which is, can you guys tell us a little bit about your the other hats that you wear? Sam, I know that you are a filmmaker.
Yeah, I do. I do pretty much any position on a film set, but writer director is my main one. Probably more screenwriting than anything, but I love directing and I also edit a lot. And I've been getting more into producing lately as well. I have a love of action choreography and stunt work as well. So I love falling down the stairs, you could say. I find that a lot of fun.
Wow. Sounds great. Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm a teacher, so that's my sort of my bread and butter. That's what I do for a living. But I'm also involved in politics. I'm the chair of the Hampshire Democratic Committee. I'm actually running for state rep in November, so I've got some other, things going on. And that, well, I mean, we do a lot of gardening around here. We grow a lot of vegetables. I had sheep until last spring. I sold all the sheep. Got apple trees. So yeah, it's like sort of we took over an old farm basically when we moved here in 2000. So it's a lot of work trying to keep the house going and trying to do some of the farming things that we've tried over the years.
It sounds like your home might be a good spot for the people in the Fall of the Polite to show up at your doorstep, and you've got food growing on trees and sheep right there, or you had sheep.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd be welcoming to some of the characters in Sam's book, but
yeah, they might not be coming in kindly.
They might not be knocking on the door. That's right, but yeah.
Well, maybe you need a guard sheep.
Yeah, that's right.
So
we got Teddy the dog.
Do you guys want to talk about any of the other projects that you have previously completed? I know, Sam, you want to mention any of the films that you worked on, and Anthony, do you want to tell us about your science fiction trilogy?
Yeah, I could just mention I have a YouTube channel where all my completed film projects are. If anyone wants to look it up, youtube.com/brickwallpictures is the link. I've also been putting out videos on the book, so there's a couple like narrated excerpts. There's a Q&A on there, that type of thing. So there's more info on the book on that channel as well.
Yeah, my science fiction trilogy is called the Jonah Trilogy, and there's 3 books. Savior, which I don't have a copy of, but the second book is The Victor's Heritage, and the third book in the trilogy is The Saints of David. So that's my science fiction trilogy. It's out there, it's available.
Tell us a little bit about it. Like your elevator pitch.
Some of the commonality is that there's a father and a son, and the family is important. It starts off with a post-apocalyptic novel about a world where there's a drug cartel trying to take over the United States, basically, and the father is kidnapped, and the son tries to rescue him. And that's the first book. The second book is jumps like 50 years into the future, and the son is now a university professor, and his daughter is a rebel teenager, and she gets kicked out of the society because she doesn't want to take the augment. There's this augment that is like a brain implant, basically, where you become part of the society. It's kind of like a coming of age thing. But she doesn't want to do that, so she takes off, and so she's kind of a rebel. And then there's the third book where, you know, it all kind of comes together. And there's a society that is like opposed to the augment that has kind of arisen, and these people are trying to join up with that society and you know, find shelter there. So it's, you know, and this it all kind of comes to a head, and there's this sort of big Armageddon battle, and everything, you know, blows up basically. So typical sci-fi.
That does sound pretty classic sci-fi right there. So do either of you want to read a brief excerpt from your books tonight?
Sure.
Should we start with you?
Yeah, I can go through one here. Okay. So this is from chapter 5, I think. They stopped at the double-doored entrance. After you, Proby said to Eamon with a gentle flutter of his gloved hand. Eamon racked his shotgun and pushed his way through the door, unlocked and unblocked. He looked left and right down 2 wide hallways. Empty save for a wheelchair and 2 tipped-over walkers. Eamon was distantly followed by the others. He came to a set of double doors opening into the courtyard. Stepping through the doors, he froze and dropped his gun. Jesus Christ, he quietly exclaimed. A pile of dead pensioners had been erected in the center of the snowy courtyard, built against the flagpole for support. The American flag flapped proudly up above. Every resident of the large retirement home, every employee, every unfortunate visitor, all dead and frozen together in a macabre amalgamation that reached far above the top of Eamon's head. Wrinkled limbs stuck out of the satanic stack as if to wave all of the good in the world farewell. Eamon's heart dropped, feeling deep within its arteries that his wife was entombed within the pile. A moment flashed in Eamon's mind, a few months after their wedding, the moment he told Beth his darkest secret. He was a disaffected youth, scratching at the open sores of society in search of a purpose. The path that ultimately led him to the gang that became his second family started out as one far more isolated and alcohol-fueled. He did all he could to live up to the ideal of masculinity that had been implanted within him by his surroundings. He drank hard, he womanized, he started fights, all the while hating himself more and more, but deluding himself into thinking the opposite. This is what I'm supposed to do. This is how I'm supposed to feel, he told himself over and over again. One cold night in Kansas City, a bar fight went too far. Eamon drunkenly threw a right hook into an undeserving lush's jaw as he had done a dozen previous times. Only this time, the lush fell in the exact wrong way. The poor sap caught the side of his skull on the edge of a wooden bar stool on his way to the floor, and his world went permanently black. Eamon thought the guy was playing possum at first, until the blood started creeping across the dirty floor and the other drunks started panicking. Eamon got out of town immediately afterward. He couldn't look Beth in the eye when he finished telling her this terrible secret. He was sure she would divorce him and leave as soon as she heard, but he couldn't keep it from her any longer. He had never told anyone what happened that night, not even his MC comrades who openly spoke of killings carried out by their hands. But Beth stayed by his side. She knew the man she married wasn't the same man from that story. She saw the pain on Eamon's face as he told his secret. She knew it had been eating up at him for years, and to her, he had paid enough for this sin. Instead of gasping and running off like he expected, she gave him a warm hug and told him he was better now. Eamon had loved Beth with all his heart for years by that point, but that was the moment that convinced him soulmates were real and that he had found his. And now his soulmate was butchered and left to rot.
All right, and Anthony, can you share some news from yours? You're gonna go grab.
I just want to say that sounded pretty macabre, Sam. Wow.
Yeah, it's a brutal story. There's a lot of
Wow. Yeah, his wife is at the bottom of the pile of dead bodies. Man, that's pretty brutal. Anyway, so yeah, I'll read an excerpt from Yet Today. This is the main character. He's come home from shopping and he's found that he's trying to figure out where his family is. So I'll just start in. Nobody was home. There was a note on the kitchen table. We've gone up to see what's in the woods. It was in the handwriting of one of the girls. Kioski could not tell theirs apart. Main character's name is Gillum Kioski. He put the milk in the refrigerator. After closing the door, he just listened for a moment. The windows in the house were all closed. They had yet to remove the caulking they put on every winter. He liked the way the house was kept shaded by the budding trees in the spring and silent from the road by the closed windows, a locked-in world all to itself. It was nice to have a momentary reprieve from the constant tangle of emotions. A conscious effort to order his own thoughts would have been right, but panic set in at the mountain looming in his mind, the seismic pools of undigested forks in the road not taken. He needed to get out more, force himself to deal positively with the gray areas of people close to him, which meant more readiness to reconcile himself to self-abasement. How much more pleasant alone, where the retaining walls held back the madness, the buzzsaw of reprisals, not having done what was necessary when it was necessary to do so. The world had lost its grip on the delusions of the old order and not yet established any accounting for the future. The peepers quieted when he approached the woods. At the stone wall, he climbed down and watched his step, looking to avoid the mud where the melting snow was still seeping to its eventual level. There was an old marker, a surveyor's post, and an old fence line of barbed wire sticking to the trunk of a hemlock. He cut across the almost invisible flow of water, bouncing on moss-covered roots. Once on the other side, he climbed diagonally along the westward sloping hill through the second-growth hemlock and the stands of hardwood, growing up in the spotty sun. He heard their voices. Gabriella and Hope were fighting each other in a mock stick battle, and Jonah was laughing, instigating. He waited behind a tree. They came running past. Kioski froze, hoping he would not give away his location. They raced on through the undergrowth, trying to catch up with Sybil. They were on their way to the beaver pond. It used to be more readily accessible from the road, but with the new houses that had gone up in the last 5 years, they had to take this back way. Kioski circled behind, keeping them in his sights. He loved them with a painful recognition that they were more than just the children and wife in his life. They were a root and a branch, and more than that, they were life. And he was just a spark of murderous recognition that did not even exist in this vacuum that he'd created. He was part of the woods, and they were going on without him, a laughing flow of humans existing together. He watched his children playing and his wife walking soberly ahead. He was most amazed by Sybil. He couldn't help remembering her as a timid young girl, and now her low voice was watchful and wise. He stayed and watched them play along the banks of the pond, the beaver dam cloaked by the woods behind them in the distance. In the winters of the past, they had skated out here. The big steps had been his, the daring steps out onto a frozen waste. So, a little picture of the family and the changing relationships.
You know, I'm not going to lie. When you started describing the family, I had a little pang of fear after Sam's excerpt there. I was a little afraid for them.
Right. Right.
So, Anthony, you mentioned when we discussed this event early that your book revolves quite a bit around the theme of family. Do you want to explore that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like a hardwired need. We all need to be part of something, and yet, the whole notion of family is changing. It has been changing for a long time, I guess. But I think especially nowadays, there's so much going on with gender relationships and questioning of the way males have tended to dominate society, basically the patriarchy, and so there's a lot of change that's happening as a result of questioning the roles of men and women, and that's being played out in families and in real time, and so I think we don't hear that perspective from the male side very often, especially in literature. I don't think. I mean, in the past we did. Obviously, white males dominated most things that were read and written. But I don't think that in the contemporary situation that's as true as it once was. And so that's why I thought that I would write this book yet today from the perspective of a man going through the changes that men go through, in any time, any historical period, but especially nowadays with the changes in gender relationships and the questioning of patriarchy and how that plays out in the family. And it's still an important thing for people. We have family. We all come from families. It's not something that's going away, but it's just being sort of redrawn and reconfigured.
So, Sam, I know we mentioned, I asked you if we could talk about family of origin with Anthony, and then found family with you, and you clarified this is not a found family story. Can you talk at all about the role that family plays in the building of the characters in their individual lives, not as their happy little group, happy or unhappy, I should say?
Yeah, so family is definitely present in everyone's life, and there might be a little bit of a found family thing going on here, a tiny bit of it. I'd say it's a much more present way to look at family in this book would be family lost, rather. People losing family members being what drives them along in this story, or a desire to reunite with family members that they've been separated from over the course of this. So family is a motivator for good and for bad in this story.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question, and let's, I think, talk about what do you hope people walk away from your novel with?
Sam, I'll let you go first on that one.
Okay. Yeah, I want first and foremost people to be entertained. I want it to be an enjoyable reading experience that will stick with people. I want it to be brutal and harsh and maybe make you put the book down for a second and like take a breather. But I want it to be a cathartic experience as well.
So not a beach read.
I mean, maybe. Yeah, it depends who you are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I want people to take away from my book is sort of a new consciousness of the importance of the moment, of living for the moment and living for the people around them, and the sort of the beauty and fragility of the small things in life, the small moments and the small things, the details that make life special. So, it's kind of an inspirational book. I mean, it's been called sort of a somber gray book, but I kind of hoping that it's an inspirational book, really. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So it will file it under inspirational then, and at the bookstore. All right.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So, thank you so much, the both of you, for joining us here this evening. We have recorded this, so we will be putting this up on YouTube in the next few days. If any of you think you have a friend in your lives who would have enjoyed this event or would like to know more about these books, please do keep an eye out for that link. We will be sending it to attendees afterwards. And please do share the link with your friends. We have the books for sale in the bookstore, and Sam's been a little bit delayed through non-essential shipping, but they are coming, and you can pre-order one and we'll send it right out, give you a call when it shows up. And Anthony's are already in the store. They are signed and ready to go. So we welcome you to give us a call or click on our website for that. And on that note, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for Gibson's Bookstore Events Program Remote. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for coming, and thank
hosting.
you, Elizabeth. Thanks to Gibson's for having us.
Absolutely. Have a great night.
Good night.